It began as an ordinary morning in Charleston. Quiet streets washed in soft golden light, families going about their routines, children's laughter echoing faintly through suburban neighborhoods. But for one home on Ashfield Drive, that illusion of peace was shattered forever. Behind its white shutters and flower-lined porch, a nightmare had unfolded, one that no one in the community could have imagined, and one that would leave investigators grappling with questions that might never truly find answers. Sophia Mitchell had always been the kind of woman people described with warmth in their voice. 33 years old, an elementary school teacher, endlessly patient, endlessly kind. Her husband, David, worked in construction management. Long hours, steady hands, a dependable man who loved his family more than anything else in the world. Together they had 2 boys, Liam, 6 years old, endlessly curious and bright, and Noah, just 3, a whirlwind of energy who seemed to live in his Captain America costume. They were the picture of suburban happiness, the kind of family that waved at neighbors, that made cupcakes for school events, that turned their front yard into a maze of laughter every summer. But sometimes, beneath the glow of normal life, darkness festers quietly, unnoticed, until it finally breaks through. When the call came in to the Charleston County Dispatch Center that morning, it sounded like any other domestic emergency. A neighbor had noticed the front door ajar, a car running in the driveway, but no movement inside. At first, no one expected anything beyond an accident, maybe a break-in, a misunderstanding. But what the first responding officer found inside that house would mark the beginning of one of the most haunting investigations Charleston had ever seen. The scene was eerily still. The television in the living room was on, muted, showing a morning news broadcast. A breakfast plate sat on the counter, half-eaten. Nothing seemed out of place until the officer turned the corner toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. That's where everything changed. Sophia lay motionless near the doorway of the master bedroom, a dark stain spreading across the carpet beneath her. Further down the hall, Liam and Noah were found in their shared room, still in their pajamas. It was clear immediately that none of them had survived. Word spread fast, too fast, and within hours news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing a neighborhood frozen in disbelief. People who had waved at the Mitchells the night before now stood on the sidewalk, hands over their mouths, whispering questions no one could answer. David Mitchell had been at work when police reached him. Witnesses later described how he collapsed in the hallway of his office building when he was told the news. By the time he arrived home, the entire area was sealed off with yellow tape, and officers gently but firmly kept him from crossing the line. All he could do was stand there, shaking, eyes locked on the front door of the home he'd shared with the people he loved most. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, the first puzzle they faced was the utter lack of forced entry. The locks were intact. The alarm system hadn't been triggered. Whoever had entered that house either had a key or was welcome inside. Detectives initially assumed it might have been a burglary gone wrong, until they realized nothing was missing. The jewelry on Sophia's dresser was untouched. The family electronics were still there. Even cash left in a drawer remained in place. This hadn't been about money, it had been personal. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A security camera across the street, belonging to a neighbor, had captured a shadowy figure walking toward the Mitchell home around midnight. The footage was grainy, but the outline was distinctive: small frame, feminine gait. The investigators didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the killer. By dawn the next day, detectives had identified the figure, 17-year-old Ashley Callison, David's younger sister. Ashley had always been described as quiet, polite, but distant. She lived with her parents just 15 minutes away and had grown up idolizing her older brother. In photos, she smiled sweetly, often holding her nephews in her arms. No one could have imagined that she'd one day be accused of taking their lives. When officers arrived at the Callison residence to speak with her, Ashley appeared calm, almost too calm. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone. When they asked her about the night before, she didn't hesitate. "I was home," she said softly. "I didn't go anywhere." But when they asked if she'd heard about her sister-in-law's death, her reaction caught their attention. She didn't cry. She didn't seem shocked. She simply tilted her head and whispered, "Oh." Inside the Callison home, detectives found something that would unravel her alibi entirely. A pair of sneakers with faint reddish-brown stains along the soles, and a sweatshirt with what looked like blood near the cuff. Tests later confirmed it. The blood belonged to Sophia Mitchell. The arrest of Ashley Callison sent shockwaves through Charleston. The idea that a teenager, a beloved member of the very family that had just been destroyed, could be responsible was incomprehensible. News anchors spoke of it in stunned tones. Neighbors stood outside their homes, shaking their heads, asking why. But the why was what no one, not even the detectives, could yet understand. In her first interview with police, Ashley sat stone-faced. Her voice was flat, almost clinical. When asked if she'd been at Sophia and David's house, she denied it, even as investigators placed photos of the security footage in front of her. "That's not me," she said quietly. "I was asleep." The detectives pushed harder, describing what they'd found. The shoes, the sweatshirt, the traces of gunpowder residue on her hands. Still, Ashley didn't flinch. When one investigator leaned forward and asked, "Ashley, why would you hurt them?" she just stared back and whispered, "I didn't." It was that detachment, the lack of visible emotion, that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. Later, one would describe it as talking to someone who wasn't entirely there. Meanwhile, the autopsy revealed chilling details. Sophia had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. The boys had both been killed instantly, likely before Sophia could reach them. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting the killer had known exactly where to go and who to target. When investigators searched Ashley's laptop, the final pieces of the puzzle began to appear. Her search history was a dark window into a mind unraveling. Articles about how to make a murder look like a break-in, questions about gun safes, and even threads discussing what happens if you shoot someone in their sleep. There were deleted photos of Sophia and David's wedding, screenshots of messages between Sophia and David that Ashley had no reason to have. The narrative that began to emerge was one of twisted jealousy. A young woman who'd grown resentful of her sister-in-law, convinced that Sophia had somehow taken her brother away from her. Prosecutors would later describe Ashley's motive as pathological possessiveness, an obsessive attachment to her brother that had turned toxic. But even with that theory, the brutality of what she'd done, the methodical, emotionless nature of it, defied comprehension. When she was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's grief turned to disbelief and fear. How could this quiet teenager, this girl who had once been trusted to babysit the boys she killed, commit such an act? In court, as the charges were read aloud, Ashley sat motionless. No tears, no visible fear, just an empty stare fixed on the judge. As the investigation continued, the portrait of her psychological state deepened. Teachers described her as intelligent but withdrawn, prone to sudden mood swings. Her parents mentioned bouts of depression, times when she'd isolate herself for days. But no one, not even those closest to her, had seen this coming. Reporters began digging into her background, unearthing fragments of journal entries, social media posts, cryptic messages about feeling invisible, overshadowed, forgotten. One post made months before the murders simply read, "If no one notices you when you're alive, maybe they will when you're gone." The story was no longer just a family tragedy. It had become a mirror reflecting something much darker, the hidden turmoil that can grow inside someone without anyone realizing, until it's too late. And as the case prepared to go to trial, one chilling truth hung in the air. This wasn't just about how a young woman lost control. It was about how a family's love had been turned, somehow, into something lethal. The courthouse in Charleston stood like a monument to history. Old stone, tall windows, a place where the weight of truth and consequence had pressed down on generations. But that spring morning, it felt different, colder. The air seemed heavier somehow, as though even the building itself sensed that what was about to unfold inside was beyond ordinary tragedy. Reporters filled the steps, cameras humming as they waited for the arrival of the girl whose name had turned into a haunting echo across South Carolina, Ashley Callison. Just 19 years old now, thin, pale, with hair pulled tightly back and wrists marked by the faint indentations of handcuffs. She looked more like a frightened student than a killer. Yet behind those wide, expressionless eyes lay a story that would chill even the most jaded observer. Inside the courtroom, the Mitchell and Callison families sat on opposite sides. Two halves of the same lineage, now separated by grief and disbelief. David Mitchell sat in the front row, flanked by relatives and officers. His face was gaunt, the skin beneath his eyes bruised from sleepless nights. In front of him was the young woman who had stolen everything from him, and still part of him struggled to reconcile that fact. That was his sister, the same girl he had once carried on his shoulders when she was small, the one who used to call him her hero. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Only the soft, rhythmic clicking of reporters' keyboards filled the void. The prosecutor began with quiet precision, his tone steady but seething with contained outrage. On the night of June 12th, he said, his voice echoing across the wood-paneled room, the defendant, Ashley Callison, entered her brother's home. She did not break in. She did not force her way inside. She walked through the front door as someone trusted, as someone loved. He paused, letting that last word hang heavy. And, in the span of less than 10 minutes, she destroyed an entire family. The defense didn't contest the physical evidence. There was too much of it. The blood on her clothes, the surveillance footage, the firearm residue. But what they tried to build instead was a different kind of story. One not of evil, but of mental fracture. Ashley's attorney, a thin man with tired eyes named Randall Pierce, rose from his seat slowly, speaking with an almost mournful tone. This case, he said, is not about hatred. It's about illness. It's about a young woman whose mind had been breaking long before this tragedy occurred. We are not here to excuse what happened. We are here to understand it. As he spoke, Ashley sat motionless, hands folded on the table before her. Every so often, she would glance at the jury, then quickly look away, as though afraid to be seen. The prosecution painted her as cold, methodical, a girl who had planned every detail. They spoke of jealousy that had turned poisonous, of an obsession with her brother that had blurred into something unnatural. They read aloud text messages Ashley had sent to a friend weeks before the killings. She doesn't deserve him. She doesn't love him the way I do. The friend, now sitting in the witness box, trembled as she recalled those messages. I thought she meant it like sibling love, she whispered, voice cracking. But after it happened, I realized she meant something else. Something wrong. Each witness added another fragment to the mosaic of a young mind collapsing under invisible pressure. Teachers described how Ashley's grades had plummeted after David got married. Her therapist testified that she had shown signs of dissociation, delusional attachment, and distorted emotional reasoning. Yet none of that, the prosecution argued, changed what she had done. When it was time to present the forensic evidence, the room fell into the cold stillness of grim fascination. Photographs were projected onto a screen, the crime scene, the shoe prints, the bedroom walls. Gasps rippled through the spectators. David turned away, eyes clenched shut, his body shaking as the images of his children appeared before the court. Ashley didn't look away, not once. Her gaze remained fixed, as though she was staring into something only she could see. The defense leaned heavily on the psychiatric evaluation. They called to the stand Dr. Lauren McCready, a forensic psychologist who had spent hours interviewing Ashley after her arrest. Dr. McCready spoke softly, carefully. When I first met Ashley, she said, she was detached, emotionless, almost mechanical. But beneath that surface I found deep psychological fractures. She exhibited signs of what we call erotomanic delusion, the belief that another person, often someone unattainable, reciprocates feelings that they do not. In this case, that fixation was directed toward her brother, the courtroom murmured, a ripple of shock running through the rows. Even those who had followed the case closely weren't prepared for the word delusion to sound so intimate. So horrifying, Dr. McCready continued, Ashley believed that Sophia was an obstacle, that she had taken something from her. Over time, this fixation deepened into resentment, then obsession, and finally violence. In her mind, the act was not murder, it was liberation. For a brief second, the jury stared at Ashley as though seeing her for the first time. A child trapped in a mind too dark for her age, but the prosecution struck back fiercely. Delusion doesn't load a gun. It doesn't aim at a sleeping child. It doesn't pull the trigger twice to make sure the job is done, the prosecutor said, voice trembling with rage. That's not mental illness. That's choice. Ashley didn't react. As the days passed, the trial became a spectacle, cameras flashing outside, the public torn between anger and morbid curiosity. Some saw her as a monster, others as a tragic figure, a product of neglect, isolation, and untreated mental decay. The media dubbed her the sister killer. Tabloids splashed her photo across covers with headlines like "Pretty, Smart and Deadly," reducing a complex, horrific story into something consumable. And in the process, the humanity of everyone involved began to fade behind the noise. One afternoon during the third week of testimony, David was called to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he walked forward, his hands trembling slightly as he took the oath. When he began to speak, his voice cracked on the first sentence. "She was my sister," he said, eyes downcast. "I loved her. God help me, I still love her. But what she did..." His voice broke, and for a moment he couldn't continue. "There's no way to explain it. I keep asking myself what I missed, what I didn't see." He turned slightly, looking at Ashley for the first time since the arrest. "Why?" he whispered. It wasn't a question for the court, it was a plea, a desperate, trembling question from a man whose heart had been split in two. Ashley blinked, her lips parting as though she might answer. But she didn't. She just lowered her head and whispered something no one could hear. The judge called for a recess soon after, but the moment lingered, the image of a brother staring at his sister, both destroyed by the same act. As the trial neared its end, the prosecution presented one final piece of evidence, a letter found in Ashley's room, written weeks before the murders. It was folded neatly, as though it had once been meant to be given to someone, though it never was. "I don't want to lose him. I don't want to be replaced. Every time she smiles, I feel something die inside me. I know it's wrong to feel this way. But she took him from me, and I'm the one left alone." The letter was signed simply, and when the prosecutor finished reading, the room was utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. The defense made one final plea for leniency, that Ashley be given psychiatric treatment instead of life imprisonment. "She's not a monster," Pierce said quietly. "She is a broken child who never received the help she needed." But when the jury filed back into the room hours later, their expressions told the story before the foreman even spoke. Guilty on all counts, Ashley showed no reaction. No tears, no outburst. She simply lowered her head as the judge's voice filled the room. "For the murders of Sophia Mitchell, Liam Mitchell and Noah Mitchell," he said solemnly, "you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. Not from surprise, but from the sheer finality of it as she was led away. Shackled and silent, Ashley glanced back once toward her brother. Their eyes met briefly across the room. He looked at her not with anger, but with something far more painful, pity. And in that fleeting glance, it was clear that no sentence, no punishment, could ever repair what had been destroyed that night. The doors closed behind her, and the world that had once known the Mitchell family as a symbol of love and laughter was left to rebuild itself from silence. But deep down, even as the cameras packed up and the headlines faded. One question continued to haunt everyone who had followed the case. What truly drives someone so young, so close to her victims, to step beyond the edge of humanity? The sound of the gavel still echoed in David Mitchell's ears long after the courtroom emptied. Life in prison, no possibility of parole. Words that should have brought justice, maybe even peace, but instead they just sat in his chest like lead. Outside, rain had begun to fall, a soft, steady drizzle that slicked the courthouse steps and blurred the flashing lights of the cameras. Reporters shouted questions, but David walked through them like a ghost. The umbrella someone held over him barely mattered. Nothing did. He didn't go home that night. Home didn't feel like a place anymore, just a collection of walls and shadows that used to hold laughter. Instead, he drove aimlessly through Charleston until dawn, past the riverfront, the playground where Liam used to swing, the elementary school where the memorial garden had been planted. A small plaque there now read, "In memory of Sophia, Liam and Noah Mitchell, forever loved, forever missed." David stood in front of it as the sun rose, his breath visible in the cool morning air. He knelt down and touched the plaque, fingers tracing the engraved names. "I hope you're at peace," he whispered, "because I don't think I ever will be." In the months that followed, Ashley Callison's name slowly disappeared from the headlines. The world moved on, but inside the walls of the South Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, time stood still. Her cell was small, 8 by 10 feet, white walls scuffed from years of occupants. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. She rarely spoke. The guards described her as quiet, compliant, detached. The prison psychologist, Dr. Eliza Warren, met with Ashley once a week for mandatory sessions. Each time, she tried to reach beneath the surface, to find the remnants of a conscience that had gone quiet. "Do you understand why you're here, Ashley?" Dr. Warren asked during their first meeting. Ashley looked at her blankly. "Because they said I killed them." "They?" "The court, the jury. And did you?" Ashley hesitated, her eyes distant. "I remember noise, blood, but it's like watching someone else. Like it wasn't me." Dr. Warren took notes quietly. The dissociation was profound, almost clinical. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when something broke through the stillness. Once, while looking at a photo the therapist had placed on the table, a generic image of a mother and 2 children, meant to evoke empathy, Ashley stared at it for several long minutes. Then she said softly, almost inaudibly, she had that same smile when she tucked them in. "Who are you talking about?" Dr. Warren asked. Ashley's eyes flicked up, sharp for the first time. "Sophia." It was the only time she said her sister-in-law's name. For David, life became a pattern of motion without meaning. He returned to work eventually, though his colleagues said he moved like someone half alive. He sold the house, he couldn't stand the silence in it, and moved into a small apartment overlooking the river. The walls were bare except for one framed photograph. Sophia holding Liam and Noah at the beach, their faces sunlit and smiling. Every week, his parents called. His mother tried to sound strong, but her voice always trembled when she asked about Ashley. "Is she okay?" She'd ask, and David would pause, unsure how to answer. "She's alive," he'd say finally. That was the most he could give. Once, in early winter, he received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "David, they told me I should try to write to you. I don't know what to say. I know what they say I did. I know what everyone believes. But when I try to remember, it's like looking into fog. I see flashes, red noise, her face, then nothing. Sometimes I think it was a dream, but the dream won't stop. If I could go back, I would. I just don't know where I went wrong." David stared at the letter for a long time before folding it back into the envelope. He didn't tear it up. He didn't reply either. He just placed it inside a drawer and closed it, a small act of control in a life that had none. Over time, stories began to circulate among the prison staff. Some said Ashley talked in her sleep, muttering names, pleading softly in the night. Others swore they heard her whispering to someone who wasn't there. One night, a guard passing by her cell overheard her saying, "They're still here, watching me." When asked about it the next morning, she only shrugged. "Maybe I deserve it." Her file grew thick with reports of strange behavior, long silences, sudden laughter, cryptic remarks. Dr. Warren documented them all. "She exhibits signs of guilt transference," she wrote. A subconscious attempt to communicate with the victim she cannot face. But the question remained, did she feel remorse or merely mimic it? 2 years after the sentencing, David finally agreed to see her. The visitation room was sterile and silent, divided by a sheet of glass. Ashley was escorted in wearing the standard grey uniform. She looked older, thinner, paler, her once bright eyes dulled by the fluorescent light. When she sat down, she didn't pick up the phone right away. She just looked at him, uncertain, maybe even afraid. David hesitated, then lifted the receiver. "Why did you ask to see me?" he said quietly. Ashley's voice trembled when she spoke. "Because I don't remember what it felt like to be real. And you're the only one who can remind me." David exhaled, the ache in his chest sharp as ever. "You're not the same person anymore, Ashley." Maybe I never was. He almost hung up then. But something stopped him. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he saw not a monster, not a murderer, but a hollow shell, a girl broken long before the night of the killings. "You can't change what you did," he said finally. "But maybe you can learn to live with it. I can't forgive you, but I don't hate you either." A tear slid down Ashley's cheek, her first visible emotion since her arrest. "That's more than I deserve." When the guards led her away, David stayed seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from him. And for the first time in years, he whispered her name, not in anger, but in sorrow. Years later, when people in Charleston spoke of the Callison case, they did so in hushed tones, as if saying the names too loudly might awaken old ghosts. The memorial garden at Liam's school grew lush with time. Children played there again, their laughter echoing off the stone benches engraved with the Mitchells' names. David visited once a month, bringing flowers, always white lilies. He never stayed long, just enough to whisper, "I'm still here." In prison, Ashley continued her sessions with Dr. Warren. She spoke more now, though her words were fragmented, dreams, regrets, fragments of memories she couldn't piece together. Once, during a session, she asked softly, "Do you think souls can forgive?" Dr. Warren met her eyes. "Do you think yours wants to be forgiven?" Ashley didn't answer. She just stared at the window, where a single beam of light fell across the table, and for the briefest moment she smiled. Not from happiness, but from something that looked like release. The years that followed the trial moved differently for everyone. For the town, time stretched forward in neat calendar-shaped boxes, school years beginning and ending, festivals returning, children growing. But for those who had lived through the Callison case, time was less linear. It curled back on itself, circling the same moments over and over again. The screams, the silence, the trial, the gavel's final strike. David Mitchell became a man defined not by what he did, but by what had been taken from him. He no longer avoided the past. He carried it every day. In the tremor of his voice when he said their names. In the way he still reached for 4 coffee mugs each morning before remembering there was only one of him left. He worked quietly now, running the foundation he'd started in Sophia's name. It was supposed to be about education at first, scholarships for children in her school. But grief has a way of rewriting purpose, and eventually, the foundation became something else. A lifeline for families struggling with adolescent mental health. For parents who saw shadows forming behind their children's eyes and didn't know what to do. David spoke at events sometimes, though he never liked doing it. Cameras and applause felt wrong in the same breath as his children's names. But he believed in the work. Believed that maybe, if someone else could be saved, then his family's story would mean something more than pain. Inside the prison, Ashley's world was made of grey. Grey walls, grey sky through the bars, grey food, grey uniforms. Even her memories had begun to fade around the edges, the colors bleeding out until they were only fragments. A flash of sunlight on Liam's hair. Sophia's voice calling from the kitchen. The smell of cinnamon from the cookies they baked one December. But there were days when the memories came back too sharply. Days when the noise in her head grew unbearable. Shouts, crying. The echo of her own breath before everything went quiet. Those were the days she would ask to see Dr. Warren. The sessions had changed over the years. At first, they were cautious, clinical. Ashley staring at the floor while Dr. Warren asked questions that went unanswered. But as the years slipped by, the distance between them shrank. The doctor stopped taking notes halfway through their meetings. They talked instead. Not about the murders, not directly, but about the spaces around them. Loneliness, guilt, memory, identity. One afternoon, during their 10th year of sessions, Ashley said something that made Dr. Warren stop mid-sentence. "I think I loved them," Ashley said quietly. "And that's the part that hurts. Because if I loved them, then what does that make me?" Dr. Warren didn't answer immediately. There were no words for the paradox of affection and annihilation. Finally, she said softly, "It makes you human. Just one who forgot what love was supposed to mean." Ashley looked down. "Do you think people like me ever stop being dangerous? Dangerous to others? Maybe dangerous to yourself. Never. Outside those concrete walls, life moved on. The Mitchell family home was gone, sold to a young couple who had no idea what those walls had witnessed. The rooms had been repainted, the floors replaced, but every so often, someone swore they heard faint footsteps in the hallway, or laughter that didn't belong to anyone living there. David didn't believe in ghosts, but he visited the street sometimes. He'd park at the corner, sit there with the engine off, and watch the house from a distance. Once a little boy ran across the yard, about Liam's age when he died. He was wearing a Captain America shirt. The sight of it broke David in half. He started the car and drove away before the family could see the tears that blurred his vision. In the 11th year of Ashley's imprisonment, Dr. Warren retired. The two women sat across from each other in the therapy room one last time. "You've come further than you think," Dr. Warren said. "You understand things now that you couldn't before." Ashley nodded, but her expression was unreadable. "You're the only person who's ever listened without trying to fix me," the doctor smiled sadly. "That's because some things aren't meant to be fixed, only understood." They sat in silence for a long time before Ashley whispered, "I'm scared of forgetting their faces." "Then don't," Dr. Warren said gently. "Remember them differently, not as what you did to them, but as who they were. That's the only way you'll ever live with yourself." When the session ended, Ashley didn't cry. She simply placed her hand flat on the table where Dr. Warren's had been, a small gesture of gratitude from someone who had never learned how to say it aloud. By then, David had begun visiting schools around the state, talking about the importance of mental health awareness. He told parents about signs they might miss: sudden withdrawal, obsession with violence, erratic behavior, dark online searches. He didn't mention Ashley by name anymore. He didn't need to. Her story was written between every line. After each talk, people came up to thank him, mothers with trembling hands, fathers holding back tears. They called him brave, strong, inspirational. But when he went home, he sat alone in his apartment and whispered, "I'm not brave. I'm just still here." Sometimes he'd take out the time capsule he'd started, a small wooden box filled with photographs, letters, drawings, and the Captain America patch from Noah's costume. He planned to have it sealed beneath the memorial garden, with instructions to open it 25 years after Sophia and he were supposed to renew their vows. It wasn't closure. It was continuity. In the 15th year, Ashley received a letter with no name, just a foundation logo stamped in blue ink. Inside was a simple message: "I hope you're finding peace in the only place you can." They would have wanted that. There was no signature, but she knew who had written it. She stared at the words for hours, until the ink began to blur from the moisture of her tears. That night, she dreamed of Sophia, not the way she'd last seen her, but the way she was before everything shattered. laughing in the kitchen, singing along to a song on the radio, turning around to say, "You're family, Ashley. You'll always be family." Ashley woke before dawn, her chest tight. For the first time since her arrest, she prayed. Not for freedom, not even for forgiveness, just for the strength to remember them the way they deserve to be remembered. Outside, Charleston had changed. New buildings rose along the skyline, new families moved into old neighborhoods, and the children who had once planted flowers in the memorial garden were now adults with children of their own. But every spring, the garden still bloomed, a sea of white lilies, soft as memory, steadfast as grief. David still visited, though less often now. He'd grown older, his hair streaked with grey, yet when he knelt by the plaque, he still whispered the same thing, "I'm still here." It wasn't a declaration. It was a promise to keep their names alive, to turn tragedy into something resembling light. Back in her cell, Ashley began keeping a journal, pages filled not with excuses, but with small truths. Today I remembered Liam's laugh. I used to think I forgot it, but it came back in a dream. It hurt, but it was beautiful. I think that's what punishment is. Remembering what you took and realizing it was everything. The entries continued for months. Her handwriting grew steadier, her tone softer. The guards said she'd changed, calmer, quieter, more present. One even said she smiled once while helping in the prison library. She never spoke of what she'd done again. But in that silence lived an understanding too deep for words, that some wounds never close, they just learn to breathe. And so the years went on, slow and relentless. David's foundation flourished. Ashley's world shrank. But in some unexplainable way, their lives remained tethered. Two broken lines running parallel, never crossing again, yet forever linked by what they had both lost. In the end, there were no villains left in the story. Only human beings, fractured, grieving, and trying, in their own quiet ways, to make sense of the darkness they'd survived. Time, for Ashley, had become a formless thing. It no longer moved forward or backward. It simply was. Days bled into one another, unmarked except for the soft clang of meal trays and the slow fade of sunlight through the narrow slit of her cell window. The seasons changed outside, but she only knew it by the temperature of the air, the heat that seeped in through the walls in summer, the bite of cold at night in winter. Prison had stripped her of almost everything, privacy, comfort, choice, but it couldn't strip her of thought. Inside her mind, the world was still alive. She thought about the house she grew up in, the creak of the hallway floorboard outside her brother's room, the smell of rain on the pavement when they used to play in the yard. Those small things, once ordinary, became sacred, the last fragments of a life she had shattered. She still couldn't piece together the moment everything broke. People on the outside seemed desperate to explain it. Experts calling it jealousy, psychologists calling it detachment, prosecutors calling it evil. But none of those words ever sat right inside her. They were all too clean. The truth, whatever it was, felt messier. Like a storm of thoughts and feelings she could never quite hold in her hands long enough to understand. Sometimes she wondered if there had been a single second, a single breath, when she could have chosen differently, when she could have stopped herself. That question became its own kind of punishment, looping endlessly in her mind. On the outside, David was still learning to live with silence, the kind that fills the spaces where laughter used to be. It had been years since the trial, yet he still found himself talking to them, in the car, before bed, when he passed a playground and heard a child's laugh echo too close to memory. He had become something of a quiet figure in the Charleston community. Respected, even admired, though he never sought it. Reporters still reached out occasionally, wanting updates on the foundation, wanting to ask about Ashley, about forgiveness. Forgiveness, it was a word people seemed to cling to, desperate to make sense of what he had endured. But David never gave them the answer they wanted. Forgiveness, he once told a journalist, isn't something you give to make things right. Sometimes it's just something you reach for, so the anger doesn't eat you alive. He didn't know if he had forgiven her. He didn't know if he ever could. But he also knew that hate was too heavy to carry forever. And maybe, just maybe, setting it down wasn't forgiveness at all. It was survival. Years later, when David turned 50, the foundation hosted a memorial dinner. He didn't want a gala, but his team insisted. It wasn't about money, they said. It was about remembrance. He stood at the podium under the soft glow of candlelight, looking out at the crowd. Teachers, parents, students, people whose lives had been touched by Sophia's name, even if they never knew her. Every year, he began, I come here thinking I'll know what to say, but I never do. All I know is that we're still here. We've survived something none of us should have had to. And I think survival itself is a kind of tribute. He paused, his voice faltering for just a second. Sophia believed in goodness, in people, in helping them before they were too far gone. I like to think that belief didn't die with her. It just changed form. It became this. He gestured around the room. The crowd stood in silence, not with applause, but with quiet reverence, as if clapping would break the fragile peace his words had built. Later that night, when everyone had gone, David stayed behind alone. The hall was empty except for the echoes of laughter that had already faded. He looked down at the framed photograph of his family on the memorial table. Sophia's warm smile, Liam's mischievous grin, Noah's wide, earnest eyes. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, I hope I've done right by you. The silence didn't answer, but somehow he felt it listening. Inside prison, Ashley's journal had grown thicker, its pages filled with a strange mix of regret and reflection. She'd begun to write not about what she'd done, but about what she was learning, how to see herself as part of the world again, however small that world was now. The guards said she had changed. She worked in the library, tutoring other inmates who couldn't read. Sometimes she wrote letters that she never sent, to Sophia, to Liam, to Noah, to her parents, to David. One letter read, Dear David, you don't owe me forgiveness. You never will, but I hope you find peace. I think that's what she would have wanted, for both of us to stop being haunted by the same ghosts. She folded the page neatly and tucked it between the leaves of a worn Bible she kept on her desk. She never mailed it. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe writing it was enough. In her 20th year of incarceration, Ashley received a visit she hadn't expected. Her parents had aged beyond recognition, her mother's hair nearly white, her father's back stooped. When they entered the visiting room, Ashley froze. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then her mother reached across the table, her hand trembling, and whispered, You look so much like you did when you were little. Ashley's eyes burned, but no tears came. I don't feel like her anymore, her mother smiled faintly. No one ever does. We all change. But you're still my daughter, her father said little, just held her hand, a gesture that spoke of love tangled with disappointment, sorrow wrapped in the simple need to hold on to what remained. As they left, her mother turned back and said, We're proud of what David's doing. I think Sophia would be too. Ashley nodded slowly. I know. It was the first time she'd said her sister-in-law's name aloud in years. Outside, David's foundation had become a cornerstone of community outreach. School districts across the state used its programs to identify at-risk teens and provide counseling before crisis struck. Every success story, every child helped, every life redirected was another quiet victory against the darkness that had once consumed his own family. But David rarely celebrated. His victories were always bittersweet. Each reminder of healing also reminded him of what could never be healed. Still, he carried on. That was his purpose now, to keep the memory of Sophia, Liam and Noah alive, not as symbols of tragedy, but as reminders of love, of what it meant to protect, to nurture, to believe. One winter morning, snow fell softly over Charleston. It was rare, delicate flakes melting as they touched the ground. David walked through the memorial garden, the one built at Liam's old school. The flowers were gone for the season, but the playground, Noah's playground, stood bright against the grey sky. A child was laughing somewhere, the sound ringing like an echo of a life once lived. David sat on the bench, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of stillness. Not happiness, not even peace, just quiet. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I forgive you, Ashley." The words didn't feel like surrender. They felt like release. That same night in her cell, Ashley dreamt of the same snow falling outside her window, though she couldn't see it. She dreamt of Sophia standing beside her, smiling gently, her hand reaching out, not in judgment, but in something that looked almost like mercy. Ashley woke up crying, but not from fear. The tears came softly without warning, and when they stopped, she felt lighter, as if, for the first time in her life, she had finally understood what loss meant. She whispered into the quiet darkness, "I'm sorry, no one heard her." But maybe, somewhere beyond the walls, someone did. The years continued to move in their slow, relentless rhythm. The garden bloomed again. The foundation grew. The pain softened, but never vanished. And in the quiet corners of Charleston, people still remembered, not the trial, not the horror, but the names that mattered most: Sophia, Liam, Noah. Because in the end, it wasn't the crime that endured. It was the love that refused to die. It had been 32 years since the night everything fell apart. Time, in its strange way, had reshaped the world. The city had changed. Taller buildings, brighter streets, new families who had never heard the name Mitchell whispered with sorrow. For them, it was just another family that once lived in a quiet neighborhood, a name on a plaque in a garden they passed without reading. But for David, time had never really dulled anything. It had only softened the edges. The pain wasn't gone. It had simply learned how to live beside him. He was older now. His hair silvered, his hands slower. The mirror showed a man who had survived his own story, but not without cost. There were lines carved deep around his eyes, not from laughter, but from years of holding back tears. Yet when he walked through the memorial garden, now expanded and renamed the Callison Center for Healing, his step was steady. Around him children ran, laughing, shouting, alive. Teachers stood in groups, parents watched from benches. There was music somewhere, faint and warm. Every year on the anniversary, the foundation hosted a Remembrance Day. It wasn't about sorrow anymore. It was about resilience, about remembering what came after the darkness, not just what was lost. This year, David spoke last. He always did. The crowd fell silent as he took the stage, his voice softer than it used to be, but still carrying the same gravity. "I used to think healing meant forgetting," he began. "That the only way to move forward was to stop remembering what hurt. But I was wrong. Healing is remembering without letting it destroy you." He paused, his gaze drifting across the crowd. "There was a time when all I could see was the pain someone caused me. But what I didn't understand then was that pain doesn't have to define you. It can become something else, something that helps others, something that teaches you to love harder, listen closer." His voice cracked just slightly. "I can't change what happened. None of us can. But every time a child finds help because of what we've built here, every time a family chooses to reach out instead of turn away, I see them. I see Sophia and Liam and Noah. I see who they might have been, and I think that's enough. It has to be." When he finished, there was no applause, just quiet, tearful stillness. Then one by one people stood. It wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement, gratitude. That night, David sat alone in his home, a small, modest apartment near the river. The foundation was now run mostly by a younger board, but he still stayed involved. It gave him something to hold on to, a reason to get up every morning. He poured himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and opened the letter he'd received that morning. Old handwriting. Slightly shaky, but unmistakably hers. It had been sent weeks before. From the correctional facility upstate, Ashley Mitchell. The letter was brief. "David, I don't know how much time I have left. The doctors say it's spreading. Maybe it's for the best. I wanted to tell you that I think about them every day, not with guilt, though that never leaves, but with gratitude that I got to know them at all. They were light, and I lost my way in that light. I know sorry will never be enough, but it's all I have left to give. When you visit the garden, tell them I remember. Tell them I still see their faces every time I close my eyes. David stared at the page for a long time. He didn't cry. The tears had come and gone years ago, replaced now by something quieter, understanding maybe, or simply exhaustion. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in the same wooden box that held Sophia's photograph. Liam's toy car and Noah's drawing of their family. He whispered, I told you I'd carry you with me. Then he closed the lid. Ashley passed away 2 months later. The prison chaplain held a small service. No family, no friends. But there were flowers, white lilies. The warden said she had requested them specifically. Her journal was found among her belongings, a thick stack of worn pages bound with a piece of ribbon. Inside, one of the final entries read, If there is mercy in this world, it's not in being forgiven. It's in knowing someone still remembers who you were before the darkness. The journal was sent, by request, to the Callison Foundation. It now sat in a glass case in their education wing, not as a symbol of redemption, but as a reminder of consequence, of warning, of the fragile line between despair and destruction. Underneath the display, a small plaque read, Pain does not disappear when we hide it. It only becomes something else. Years later, when David could no longer walk easily, volunteers wheeled him through the garden during the annual remembrance. The air smelled of spring, lilies blooming, grass freshly cut. Children played in the distance, the kind of sound that once tore him apart, but now brought him peace. He looked up at the sky, soft blue behind drifting clouds, and whispered, I'm coming home soon. He didn't mean a place. He meant the people waiting on the other side of memory. That evening, he sat at his window again, the golden light fading over the water. On the wall behind him hung framed photos, one of Sophia laughing mid-sentence, one of Liam with his toy sword, one of Noah painting on the kitchen floor. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes when sorrow has become love again, and when the sun dipped below the horizon. It felt, for just a moment, like they were all together again. When David passed a few weeks later, the city mourned quietly. The foundation held a candlelight vigil. Hundreds came, teachers, parents, children, even strangers who'd only ever read his story. They spoke of his kindness, his strength, his unwavering belief that tragedy didn't have to end in hate. The memorial garden was renamed once more the Callison Mitchell Garden of Light. Because in the end, even the name of the one who caused the tragedy belonged there too. Not to honor her, but to acknowledge the full, painful truth of what healing really is. It's not about forgetting. It's about facing everything, the love, the loss, the horror, and the hope, and still choosing to keep going. Years later, when a young girl visiting the garden asked her mother, who were they? The woman smiled softly and said, they were a family who taught this town how to heal, and that's how their story lived on. Not in crime documentaries or newspaper clippings, but in whispers, in flowers, in the laughter of children who would never know their names but would still feel the warmth of their legacy. Because even the darkest stories, when told with truth, can leave behind a little light.